the Kenyan Olympic marathon squads were formally announced. And there was like quite a bit of controversy around this as well. And you wrote an awesome piece about it. I love your headline. You called it a swoosh affair because of Nike's influence potentially on the decision-making for who is going to run in the Olympic marathons for the Kenyan national team. So who was selected and why is this why has this caused a kerfuffle?
Okay, well, the main area of kerfuffle is in the women's selection. Okay. So it was Perez Jepchirchir, Brigid Kosgei, and Helen Obiri who were selected. And the kind of red flag there is Brigid Kosgei. Now, don't get me wrong. She is one of the best marathoners around. She's the former world record holder. But she was also selected over two runners who were on the short list, because there was 5 athletes on the short list who are in far better form than her right now. Rosemary Wanjiru and Sharon Lokedi. So essentially, I'm going to give it to you short. Wanjiru and Lokedi have outshined Kosgei by far over the last 2 years. Wanjiru has run the fastest time by a Kenyan this year, which is 2:16:14. That was when she placed second at the Tokyo Marathon. And Lokedi beat Kosgei head-to-head at the New York City Marathon, just 6-7 months ago. She placed second behind Helen Obiri, who I think right now is just on fire, so I'm excited to see her run. So where it gets interesting is with the swoosh affair. So Brigid Kosgei is a Nike-sponsored athlete, whereas Lokedi and Wanjiru are not. Athletics Kenya is also Nike-sponsored, and it's important to notice that this is not the first time a Nike-sponsored athlete has made the Kenyan team over a non-Nike-sponsored athlete. So in 2012, Moses Mosop, who is a Nike athlete, was selected over Jeffrey Mutai, Patrick Macau, and Emmanuel Mutai, who were all Adidas athletes.
Right.
In 2016, Visaline Jepkesho, a Nike athlete, was selected over Mary Katani, an Adidas athlete, on the women's side, while Wesley Courier, a Nike athlete, was selected to the men's team despite going 4 years without a podium finish in any marathon.
Wesley Courier, lovely man, by the way. I've interviewed him in the past because he's spent quite a bit of time in Canada over the years. He's married to a Canadian. Lovely guy, won the Boston Marathon, great story, great human being, good ambassador for the sport. Probably shouldn't have gone to the Olympics representing Kenya, particularly in that moment in his career. I think this is also like, if you're a fan of this sport, you're looking at this, and it's a huge mistake for Kenya because if they don't pull away, I would say if they're not, they've got a chance to go 1, 2, 3 on the podium every time, right?
Yeah.
And certainly contend for top 5, certainly top 10 in each Olympic marathon. I mean, they have a number of the best athletes in the world every single year. Between Kenya and Ethiopia, I mean, that's the center of this sport at that level in the marathon, for sure. I think Lokedi is like totally getting screwed because not only has she performed really well, she's done so on courses that are very similar to what it's going to be like running the Paris Olympic Marathon. So Paris's course is hilly and the race is not paced. Olympic marathons do not have pacers, and New York City is very hilly. Boston is very hilly. Neither of those races are paced. So if you're trying to make an informed decision about who is going to excel, who's going to give you the best chance to podium in Paris, I would be looking at New York and Boston performances first and foremost. And then I would be looking at just overall just talent level, speed secondarily. And whether or not you're like peaking and you're at the peak of your powers right now, right? And like Lokedi, it's like, come on, she won New York. She placed third in New York last year. She won in New York in 2022. And then she placed second, and it was a pretty close second in Boston, where she kind of hung in there and until sort of the last mile of the race, effectively, and also ran really, really well. So she's a gamer. I mean, it's a no-brainer. However, there's one problem with Lokedi. You know what the problem is with her?
What's the problem?
She's effectively American. She lives in the United States. She trains in the United States. She's been in the United States. I think she went to Kansas or Kansas State. So she's been in the U.S. for a number of years. She's really far away from that epicenter of Kenyan athletics, right? So, you know, she's kind of, I guess, maybe like not one of them in a certain respect, right? Or she's not part of that inner circle of athletes. And yeah, I don't know what her agent and coaching situation is like, but it seems like she's getting screwed here in particular. That sucks. I got a question for you, and this is maybe like sort of wandering into hot take territory.
All right.
Before we kind of move on from this, Eliud Kipchoge, did he earn his spot? Besides, like, it's getting the emeritus spot, did he, like, really, if you were to do like a blind analysis of like the last 18 months of running, like, would Kipchoge be the guy that your team would select?
I have so many arguments for and against him. I've been on the fence about Kipchoge for a long, long time now. Today, this is my today answer. Could change tomorrow. Okay. It was probably different yesterday. But today, I'm leaning for Kipchoge, I think.
Okay.
Now
You're
here's
zagging.
why.
You're zigging. Is that a zig or a zag?
A zag, I think, because my zig initially is no. Most of the time I've been kind of leaning towards the no, so I think this is a zag. Here's why. All right. I recently wrote the story about the online abuse he was getting after Kelvin Kiptum's unfortunate passing. And he was in a really, really tough spot, especially going into Tokyo. Like, he was saying that, you know, it wasn't just affecting him, it was affecting his family. He, you know, was losing sleep over it. You know, didn't feel safe to train. And like, I was really able to sympathize with that because as an athlete myself, I know how important like being in a good headspace is to perform, no matter what your fitness level is. Like, for example, last summer, I was in a bad spot mentally for like a couple months after I changed teams mid-season, but I was at like my best fitness I had been at the time. But I couldn't get around like a local town center race like that was an hour long, just because I just wasn't happy. Like, I was, not having a good time, but I was super fit. And so that kind of, part of me, I think it's because I really sympathize with like, you know, I think at the time no one really knew how much it was affecting him, but now he's like opened up about it. And I'm like, if he can kind of move past that and like get himself into a good headspace, he's still really talented. Like, he ran sub 203 at Berlin last year. You know, like he's still the GOAT. He's so, right now I want to believe in him. But the other part of me that doesn't is the course. He doesn't have a good track record on challenging courses like, say, Evans Tibet.
Yeah. I mean, you just made a really good point that I must admit I've never thought of that. He's a human being and he was deeply affected by this. And I think it's pretty callous of us to just dismiss that as not a factor. And he's this guy who's supposed to be able to, he's like impervious to all this. And maybe, and this is not to criticize him, but maybe part of the lure of like the sort of like, the mythology that is Eliud Kipchoge, the sort of like philosopher king, the Yoda of running, is like, oh, he's the ultimate master of his own sort of mental approach to the game of marathoning, and he can overcome any sort of mental barrier or challenge. But I mean, it sounds like this was actually a pretty significant and pretty haunting experience for him. And so yeah, that's a smart perspective that I'd not considered. But you also make a really good point that this is also a guy who's got like a pretty spotty track record when it comes to an undulating or a hilly course or adverse conditions. Like he also struggled mightily, if you remember, during that like weird pandemic London marathon. It was rainy and cold, and there was like a side wind. There was like a nasty sort of crosswind, and he stitched up and had an issue with, I think his leg was cramping, or he basically fell apart in the race. And the last couple of Olympic marathons have been relatively straightforward affairs, right? Like Rio was warm, but it was a relatively flat course. And he was also kind of like at the peak of his powers. And he also had the help of the super shoes when no one else knew that they existed. Mm-hmm. And then Tokyo, of course, until this year, he'd run pretty well in Japan, and it was a flat course as well. So yeah, it's really interesting. I think this is like, I mean, we'll talk about this in more detail when the Olympics get closer, but I think that's a pretty like wide open race in the men's marathon for sure. Maybe a little tighter in the women's race, although there's a lot of interesting contenders there as well. We'll get into that down the road.